Right, let's get underway. So for those of you who just joined us, my name is Finley Johnson with Mobility Ways. I'm happy to welcome you all to the latest webinar in our Thought Leaders series, which today is called Behaviour Change Through Active Listening. And in today's session, former hostage negotiator Nicky Perfect joins us for the third and final, for now, time. She explains how to turn active listening into your secret superpower and tune into your employees into your sustainable commuting strategy. So today, Nicky's going to talk to us about the four modes of listening and their role in influence and persuasion, how your own bias affects your listening, and using previous theory to form an overarching communication strategy. Nicky will also expand on the communication strategies she's already discussed in the previous two sessions to leave you with an actionable plan to influence behaviour change at your organisation. So if you did miss the first two webinars, first one, identifying the barriers to behaviour change, and the second one, actionable insights for overcoming barriers with behaviour change, then after this webinar, then do head over to the Mobility Ways YouTube channel, where you'll find them in our videos section. And indeed, this session will be available on our YouTube channel, as well as being sent over to you in an email link a little bit later on. So, bit of housekeeping. So the format of today's session is a presentation by Nicky, followed by a Q&A session at the end. And you'll notice at the bottom of your screens, there is a Q&A tab. So any questions that you have got for the session today, please do add them into the Q&A box, and we'll have about 20 minutes towards the end of the session, and we'll get as many of those over to Nicky as possible. You'll also notice the chat box icon. It'd be great if you'd introduce yourself to the others in the room, a little bit about yourself, maybe your LinkedIn profile as well. But once again, the chat is just for that purpose. Any questions, please go to the Q&A tab. This is also a participatory session, and we have Slido. So if you'd like to get involved, then do scan the QR code on your screens now, and you can then participate in today's session, and we'll aim to have you wrapped up at about midday. So, Nicky, I've got my trainers on. I'm at my treadmill desk. Am I ready to start active listening?
Well, there's an interesting question, and you'll definitely have the answer by the end of the session, Finn. Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you for having me back for the third time. Really lovely to be here, and looking forward to answering some of your questions and sharing some more techniques and strategies with you as we go through the next hour or so. And the question I'd really like you to start thinking about is, what's your biggest listening challenge at the moment? We talk about conscious communication. We talk about communication most of the time just being something that happens. And what part does listening really play in communication? I'm very lucky that I'm the patron of a charity called Crest, who teach young people in primary, middle school and high school how to peer mediate. And whenever I talk to them, I always say, you know, listening is an absolute superpower, because if you can nail listening, then you can find out what's really going on for the other person, and that's when you can influence and persuade. Right, so if you could download Slido and start answering what's the biggest listening challenge at the moment, we'll come back to that as we go through the presentation. I'm now going to share my screen. Works beautifully. Perfect. So we're going to talk about behavior change tactics now, and the art of listening, and what that really means. First of all, I know that some of you have been on the last two sessions and some of you haven't. There is a catch-up link in the chat if you want to go and listen to those last two sessions after today. And this will just be a very quick summary. So even if you were there, it will help your brain just to get back into focus about what we've been talking about before. You'll hear me talk about this a lot, that communication is a soft skill. I like to turn that on its head and challenge that way of thinking and say, actually, communication is a life-changing and a life-saving skill, but you have to be fully present in the moment for it to be effective. We looked at some barriers to change. And when we talked about this, we did our Slido and we talked about what's the biggest resistance that you are getting from your teams? What are they coming up with? And here were some of the biggest ones. Our values and beliefs, which we're going to talk about again today. And the reason we're going to talk about them again today is because they will affect how you listen. They're about your biases and how they play a huge part in the way that we communicate and listen to each other. We talked about convenience and habit, and that actually changing somebody's habit, influencing and persuade them to do a different thing from the thing that they have always done, is challenging, and we have to build a relationship. We know that we can only influence and persuade people when they trust us. We have something in the world called the FBI negotiation stairway, and it takes you from talking to somebody about something straight away to building trust with them. And influence and persuasion sits above trust. So if we don't have trust, then we can't influence and persuade. Remember, you cannot change another person. We spend a lot of time trying to change individuals, but what we can do is influence and persuade. And we know that listening is absolutely key to building that trust. We then have lack of viable options and cost and effort of change for the individual. So they're just some barriers to change. I appreciate there are many others. We looked at predictive dialogue, and this is where we took those barriers to change and we created some little spidergrams on the Zoom whiteboard, and we looked at the biggest ones. So for example, childcare was one of the issues. And then we thought about all the issues for that person around the childcare, the cost, having to drop off at a particular time, and then how we can overcome those challenges when we have those initial conversations. So we start with something like, I've been thinking about the world from your perspective, and I know you've got a couple of children, and we've spoken before about childcare, and the timings can be really difficult for you. So when I've been thinking about implementing the change, I've been looking at perhaps a way that we can collaborate together. How can you see us moving forward together so that you can fit childcare in and still use public transport and still be able to do a day's work? And we have those open and honest conversations involving the other person to find a way forward. We talked about the power of because, and research and studies show, especially in influence and persuasion, that when you give somebody a reason why something should or shouldn't happen and use the word because, in the brain, it triggers something that allows them to start thinking about, okay, well, I appreciate that, or I understand that a little bit more. So, for example, just recently I had somebody who couldn't come and help me run a course that I'm running. And in the message, they just said, I'm not going to be able to make it. And which is fine. And of course, some people can't make it. And in my head, I was going, I wonder why you can't make it. I wonder what's happened. Are you okay? And I start making and creating a story in my own head. Now, if the message had said, I'm unable to help you on your course because I've been given a better offer, or I'm going on holiday, or I've got to take my mum to the hospital, then there is a reason behind that. So the receiver of the message goes, I understand I understand what you're telling me, and I can see now why you can't do that. And it's called the power of because. You can play around with it. You can, I use it a lot with my teenager. It works powerfully. And if I don't get a message back, so if I say something like, could you do this? And I get a no, then I will say because, and then I'll get the reason and the rationale. And then it makes sense in my brain rather than it becoming a, what do you mean no? Why are you saying no? Why are you being resistant? Because there's generally a reason. We just have to search for it a little bit more. We talked about the 4 Ps, and I want you to keep thinking about these when you have those difficult, challenging conversations. So the first P is purpose. What is your goal? What's your overall goal in the conversation that you're having? And it doesn't have to be that you have to solve the problem in one conversation. You know, negotiation and influence is a series of conversations where we build up a relationship, where we take people on a journey. We find out what their motivator is, and then we influence and persuade around the motivator and help them to solve that problem so that we can work in collaboration. Because when people work in collaboration, you get much better results. You get employees that are still willing to put in the work, that they feel valued and they feel that they're giving value. So the first one is purpose goal. The second one is plan. We plan for eventualities. What happens if we get an emotional response? What happens if we become emotional? What happens if they refuse to do what we're asking? What happens if they leave? What happens if they keep resisting? What do we do next? How do we do this? So we start just to think about planning those conversations. I can honestly tell you, I have never had a difficult conversation or a negotiation where I haven't had some sort of plan in place. Then the third P is perspective. So we look at the world from the other person's perspective. What are the barriers from their perspective? Why is that so challenging for them? What's going on behind the scenes? It might be, if childcare is an issue, it's because the partner is giving them a particularly difficult time because they don't want the change, because it means that they will have to change. But you won't know that that is going on underneath the surface unless you're really listening to what's not being said and listening to what they are saying. So, for example, somebody says, I can't do that because of childcare. And actually, in the background, they've gone home and they've said to their partner, oh, they're changing. They want us to change how we get to work. Well, that means I'm going to have to leave a little bit earlier, which means you're going to have to take some more responsibility on. And then suddenly the partner is going, no, that's not happening. I don't want that to happen. It's always been this way. And so now you get torn between work and home life, and it becomes uncomfortable. We don't know that's happening unless we're asking the right questions, unless we're really listening to what the other person's saying. And then forgive the pun, of course, but practice does make perfect. Perfect really is my surname, by the way. If none of you have heard me speak before, it's I always say that my dad used to say to my mum that he was born perfect and she only became it when she met and married him. So yeah, so I thought I'd put a little pun in there. But practice really does make perfect. You know, listening and communication is a skill. And it's like any other skill. If we don't practice it, we can't get better at it. To practice, we have to be conscious. To be conscious, we have to be present. And we have to also think about us and how do we communicate? How do we listen? How do we behave? How are we coming across? Because we're the only people that we can change. An amazing FBI agent that I had the privilege of working with, he used to say to me, Nick, you cannot change that person in front of you. Your job is to influence and persuade them. The only thing that you actually have any control over is how you choose to respond. I'll say that again, how you choose to respond. And we use the word respond rather than react, because react is emotional. When we're responding, it's far more logical. We're more likely to be able to have those logical conversations if we have a 4P strategy in place. It doesn't have to take a long time. You can sit and do it in 5 minutes before a conversation that you're going to have with somebody, or you can spend more time thinking about it. The more effort that you put into it, the easier the conversation will be. And as you start to practice it and you start to get better at it, then sometimes just before you go into a meeting, you can go, oh, what were those 4Ps? Oh, yeah, I remember. Yeah, purpose, plan, perspective, and practice. How do I practice? Well, I'm just going to say out loud my opening line. So I'm going to introduce myself. I'm going to say out loud. I might use some predictive dialogue. I'm just going to see how that sounds. I might even record myself on the way. I will definitely get a trusted person to listen to me or to read my email over just in case it's a little bit emotional. And now we're going to go into listening. So Jackson, now would be a great time if you could just share, I'll stop sharing, if you could share the results of that Slido, please. Let's see what your biggest challenges were around listening. Here we go. Concentration, yeah, distractions. Yeah, we're distracted all the time, aren't we? All the time. I have my mobile phone here next to me that I'm keeping an eye on the time. But if that buzzes or that flashes, I have to turn everything off when I'm doing a presentation so I don't get distracted. But we are trained now. It's almost like we've been conditioned that if our mobile phone is in our pocket and it vibrates, that suddenly becomes the most important thing. even when we're having a conversation with somebody. And I'm sure you can relate to this, where you've been having a conversation with somebody, their phone vibrates, they take it out of their pocket, they look at the message that has come in. How do you feel? Because I'm guessing it's not valued and validated and important in that person's life in that split second. Let's have a see what else. Yeah, my existing beliefs around people's motivations. Yeah, and that's brilliant that you recognize that consciousness around what are my biases, what am I thinking? Focus, logistics, not prejudging, and we do judge. We judge all the time, especially when we have a person who takes up a lot of our time, who is really resistant, who we seem to go around in circles with. So all the plans and strategies that we have them for the majority of the people. There will always be outliers who are more challenging to deal with. And that's when we give them a really good listening. That's when we start to involve them in that decision-making process. Okay, what will work for you? What has to happen for this to happen? What would you like to see? What can we change? How can we adapt? What do we need to do? And we'll go through all of these as the presentation goes on. Thank you for that. I'll go back to sharing my screen. So here we are listening. Here's one of my favorite quotes. People who feel listened to are more likely to listen to you. People who feel listened to are more likely to listen to you. It's called the law of reciprocity, which comes from the book Influence and Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. And it basically means I am giving you my time. I'm giving you space. I'm giving you my presence. And when we do that, when we give somebody a really good listening to, and MRI scans have proved this, that when they do MRI scans of the brain and you give somebody a really good listening to, when they're talking about themselves, because we like to talk about ourselves and give an opinion, and there's nothing wrong with that, it's just about recognizing that. Or when we're talking about something we're very passionate about, that we believe strongly in, it lights up the same part of the brain as the part that gives us a big dopamine hit. So every time you listen to somebody, you help them to feel valued and validated and important, and they get a feel-good feeling. So it's a win-win all round. Here's another of my favorite quotes around listening. I know that you believe what you think I said, but I am not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. And this is about the translation that we have in our heads. We make stories up, we make assumptions, we listen from our perspective, and we interpret the message that we've been given according to what we believe to be true. So we're going to have a look at some barriers to listening and what affects the way that we're listening, and also why is listening so important. So for me, this is one of my beliefs. I believe that listening is a superpower, absolutely, because it helps us to build trust and influence. It helps us to get somebody to trust us a lot quicker if we are able to really listen to what they're saying. People will remember us. There's that great quote, I can't remember if it's on the slides today, about, people might not know your name or what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. I used to work with somebody who, every time I left the room after having a conversation with her, I felt like the most important person in the world. That is an incredible skill. And actually, I would work harder for her. And if she asked me to do something, I would then do it. And if she asked me for my opinion, I would give it freely, because I knew that there would be no judgment and that she would listen to that. And listening is a skill. And like we've already said, all skills need to be practiced. Let's have a quick look at some barriers to listening. Values and beliefs. We're never taught how to listen. If you think about your school days, we're always taught to speak, show and tell, stand up in front of a class, have those presentation skills, but we're never really taught how to listen. Sometimes, depending on how we feel, we'll create a barrier to listening. And we're going to focus on values and beliefs because they're so important around the big part that they play in our lives. Now, a belief is an internal feeling that something is true, even though that belief may be unproven or irrational. So what beliefs do we have when we're talking about behaviour change around getting public transport, changing the environment, changing our climate, changing our beliefs? We'll all have beliefs about this already. Some people will say there is no climate change. Some people will say that's not right. There's loads of scientific proof now to show that there is climate change. Some people will say, well, do you know what? What's the point of me doing it when the big countries are not doing any change. So they'll have a belief system around that. There'll be a belief system that all trains are late. There'll be a belief system around that I've always done it this way, so it's comfortable for me. There'll be a belief system that like religion is a huge belief system. If you have that belief system in religion, or if you don't have it, it's still another belief system. There's a reason that they say do not talk about politics and religion, because they're really strong belief systems. And you only have to look at what is happening across the world today to see that. And when somebody challenges our belief system, when somebody says, no, that's not right, it's like they're saying, no, you're not right. And that causes us to feel like we're being personally attacked. So if we have a belief system that this is the best thing for the company, and we're promoting it, and we're doing our best to find ways around how we can improve our team members or employees, transportation, and somebody says, no, well, you're just not right. You're just not right. And that can feel like, whoa, hang on a sec. That can feel like a personal attack. And then you've already said in the Slido that you have belief systems about some of the people, about what they're already thinking, about why you believe that to be true. Lateness is another great one around beliefs. We'll all have a opinion and a belief around people being late. And parenting is another belief. Christmas is another one. We are surrounded by our belief systems, and they drive everything we do. And we'll keep coming back to that. I'm going to ask you to start thinking about what your beliefs are around people that you work with, the conversations that you have, and also how things should be. Then we have values that stem from our beliefs. Now, all of this comes from the country we're born in, the region of the country, the street within the region, the house within the street, and then the immediate people around us who bring us up. So a value is a measure of worth or importance we attach to something, and it's reflected in the way that we live our lives. So, for example, if family life is of high value of one of your employees, one of your team members, and they drop the children off at school and they pick them up, that is a big challenge to overcome, because it's how they live their life. You will definitely need to involve them in that conversation and help them to find a way forward, as you will also need to listen to them intently to find out what their values are. So when we listen to people, we find out what their values are, and then we can use those values as motivators. They're things of how we've learned people should behave. And when people don't behave in a specific way, it causes us that emotional conflict in our own minds. Maurice Massey is a child psychologist from America. He says we get our values from 3 different spaces: 0 to 7, when we're first learning everything, soaking it all up like a sponge. Then we have 8 to 13, where we start to model other people. We go to school, we listen to different ideas, we listen to our peers, we listen to our peers' siblings as well, and we start to use maybe language that we haven't used before. This is when your kids come home from school and you're like, I've never heard you use that language before. Where's that come from? And then we have like the adolescent period between 13 to 21, where they're socializing, they're getting their own experiences, they're getting to know everything, that's starting to form how they think and what they believe to be true. And of course, this can cause a lot of conflict, especially in a parent-child relationship. And we now know that the adult brain doesn't fully form until the mid-20s. And with young men, the risk element of that brain doesn't form until the late 20s. So sadly, that is why so many young men die in road traffic accidents, and also risk-taking adventures like cliff diving and things that they do on holiday. So there are values. We are never taught how to listen. We covered that earlier. I'll just whiz through this because we've already covered this really. But at school, we're praised for talking. Listen to me is always said in an authoritative way, and communication and listening are viewed as soft skills. Then how are we feeling? We talk about the emotional and the logical brain. We talked about this before, and the chimp paradox. But when we're in that emotional state, you cannot listen. You won't be hearing what the other person's saying. You'll be having your own internal dialogue. You'll be making assumptions. You'll be pushing back. You'll either be aggressive or submissive. But when we're in the logical brain, which is really easy to say as we sit here today on a Wednesday, where hopefully you're in a nice, calm, logical space as you're listening to this presentation, because when we're in that logical space, we can listen and we can give our own perspective. But actually being in that logical space is incredibly difficult. It really is, especially when our values and our beliefs are being pushed against. So we have to have a strategy of how do we go from emotional brain to logical brain. The only way to do that is to actually know yourself very well. And if you can feel it, I know that I can feel it across my shoulders. I know that I can feel it in my chest and my stomach. I might get sweaty palms and my brain will start to race. And I have to have a strategy in place where I go, whoa, hang on a sec, Nick. Start listening, start bringing your brain back because you're off on emotional state. And sometimes I'll even say, do you know what? I'm really sorry. Can we come back to this conversation? Because I can feel my brain going into the emotional side and the emotional state. And I don't want to say or do anything that will be detrimental to this conversation. And it's not fair on you. Now, my computer seems to be whizzing off on its own, doing those strange things that computers do. But we are going to look at 4 modes of listening. We're going to look at the main ones all together, and then we're going to go through them individually. So we've got combative, competitive, passive, and active. So combative listening, this is where you listen to be right based on your belief system. So you're looking for all the evidence that will make you right. And then what you will do is you will take that evidence like a game of tennis and bat it back to the other person. We talk over the other person. So we don't let them finish their sentences. We might be sarcastic, and it's definitely emotional brain listening. An excellent place to listen to combative listening is Prime Minister's Question Time. And you'll see all of those being exhibited. Competitive listening is one of my favorite. You've probably already heard it today. A great example of competitive listening is this. Hey, how are you today? Oh, do you know what? I've just got a terrible cold. And so what we do is we hear that, but then we generally respond in one of 2 ways, which is to add a little bit to our story and listen to it for our turn in the conversation. So, hey, how are you today? Oh, do you know what? I'm not feeling so great. I've got a terrible cold. 2 responses that we generally give to in the UK to that are, oh yeah, there's loads of that going round. Or, oh yeah, I've had that cold. Oh my goodness, it was awful. In fact, it was so bad I gave it to the kids. Then the kids were off at the same time that I was off, and it was just absolutely awful. And then you might add a little bit in your turn, which would be like, yeah, in fact, the school, our local school had to close completely. And my Aunt Mabel, she got that cold, went to her chest, she had pneumonia, ended up in hospital. And that is competitive listening at its best. I'm sure you've probably heard a conversation like that recently, or something very similar, where we are adding our turn. Now, all we have to say is we can listen really carefully and we can hear that that person is having a challenging time. You know, hey, how about you today? Oh, do you know what? I'm not so great. I've had a terrible cold. Well, that sounds really challenging for you. And just by changing that sentence and those words, I'm building a better relationship. I'm listening to what they're saying. They're feeling valued and validated. Their dopamine hit is coming in. We are going to get to an influence place a lot quicker because just by changing that one sentence. Then we have passive listening. Again, most of us do this at some stage. You might be watching a favorite program. You might be reading a book. Somebody comes to start to talk to you, and you actually do 2 things at the same time, which we know doesn't work. And we pretend to listen by doing this. Oh, yeah. Okay. Now, if maybe you're in your office, if you have open plan and someone comes, stands by your desk and it's clear that they want to talk to you, but you're typing out an email and you're focused on the email, but they're not going away. So it's obviously that they want to say something to you. And so you end up going, carry on, I'm listening. Now you know that the other person isn't. The other person, because they've got something to say, even though they can see you are busy, will still say it anyway. As human beings, we just do this. We offload what we have to say and give it to another person. So the other person carries on talking. You do that. Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, great. Off they go, thinking, I haven't been listened to. And you're like, what did they say? I'm not sure. A quick way of solving that would just to do something like this. I can see that this is really important to you. Give me 2 minutes to finish up this email. I'll come and find you and we'll have a proper conversation. Or if you're the person coming to speak to the other person and you can see that they're busy, you can just say something along the lines of, oh, I can see you're busy. I just want 2 minutes of your time to tell them what you want to talk about so that not left thinking about it. And then you can have a proper conversation where you're both present, where you're both listening. And it's not one of those superficial conversations where there's loads of other things going on. We often listen to our own internal dialogue, especially if we have a very quick brain. If any of you have done disc profiling or behaviors, it's the hurry up person or the red brain. It's where your brain is so fast that you're already finishing other people's sentences for them. You're already onto the other conversation. You're not really listening. Your internal dialogue's going and you're thinking, well, I've got to do this, this, and this, and I need to move on. But the person in front of me is still giving me the detail and I don't need any more. And that's kind of where your internal dialogue comes in. Active listening is where we're fully present. Again, it sounds so easy, but it's actually a very conscious decision to be there, to be listening with no judgment, which again sounds so easy, but we do judge. We know we judge, and we judge for the right reasons. It makes us human. It comes from the primitive side of the brain where we are judging to make sure that we are safe. And we like people who are like us. We like people who communicate in the same way that we do. We like people who have the same values and beliefs that we do. We like people who are just like us because it helps us to feel safe. So we have to put the judgment to one side and we have to really focus on the words and the tone and what's not being said. I have negotiated with some horrible people, in my opinion, who've done some horrific things before. And you have to train yourself to put the judgment to one side. So how do we show to the other person that we are listening? We have something called the listening pose, as you can see it's happening here. The listening pose is where we are leaning in or we're fully present, we're there, no distractions, our phones are off or to one side, and we're fully focused with that other person. It shows the other person that we are listening to them. It helps them to feel valued and validated. We give minimal encouragers, not the same as passive listening, but we ask people, we say, oh, tell me a bit more about that. So when we take our turn in the conversation, we're going to have a minimal amount to say because we want it to be about the other person. We call it the 70-30 rule. So 70% of the time we are listening, 30% of the time we are talking, especially when we're in those initial conversations of finding out why there is resistance, what's happening for the other person, what their motivators are, how we can move the conversation forward. Then we have open questions, things like what, where, who, when, how, and why. Sometimes we avoid why because when we have adult to adult conversations, that's where we have the best conversations. Sometimes when we use the word why, it can sound like parent to child conversation, and then we don't get the best interaction, the best communication, the best results that we could do. We have reflective language. Reflective language is where we say what we hear and say what we see. And it a bit like that, the game on TV. And so I'm going to label what I'm seeing. I might say, well, I just mentioned that and I noticed you raised your eyebrow. I'm just checking in that everything's okay. Or I might say something like, you sound very frustrated when we talk about this. Or you sound very resistant to what I'm suggesting. And I'm wondering why that is. When we say, I am wondering why that is, we're just explaining what's happening in our own minds. And it's a softer language to use when we're trying to find out what's happening for the other person. And then we have something summarizing. Now, summarizing are perfect when you can feel yourself becoming emotional. So we go, oh gosh, I'm feeling emotional. What can I do? Oh yeah, I know I can summarize. And what summary does is it makes you listen. So you know all the distractions that you have. If you set yourself the challenge of, I have to summarize this conversation when it's finished, that will keep you present. And that will mean that you will actively listen and be in that moment for a longer space of time. It also helps you when you don't really understand what's happening. It helps the other person because when you summarize and you kind of say back what they have said, it helps them to see. And they're like, oh, actually, that's not really what I meant. Or actually, that's not really how I feel. I think it's more this. So we're helping the other person to untangle what's going on in their mind as well. Right. I would like you to be fully present for the next 30 seconds and just listen to what I've got to say. And then I'm going to ask you some questions. When I am gone, I will be at peace. I find it hard to get about. I'm a prisoner in my own home. Lots of the old crowd have gone, and more I think it's time for me. I do like your visits, but they also remind me of what life was like. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'd like you to answer some of these questions, please, in the Q&A. The first question is that person that's been talking male or female? Male or female? If you could answer in the Q&A, please. There's no right or wrong. No right or wrong. Just type your answers. I just want to get a rough feel. This will be your immediate reaction based on what you believe to be true, based on what you heard. Some of you won't know. Yeah. So a lot have got female. Some of you got male, which is interesting, isn't it? Because I don't feel that I have a male voice. Not clear. Yeah, absolutely. Female, female, female. Great. The next question is, how old are they? How old is that person? Again, just go with your gut. Don't overthink it. It's not a trick. It's just go with your gut. What are you thinking? Elderly, late 80s. That's really specific. Great. 24. So somebody 95, 30. So again, we're getting different answers based on your experiences, your beliefs, your values. Some of you will have had definitely have had your own experiences. I'm 57 this year, and I've had this experience with my dad, who we sadly lost in 2022. So you'll have your own experiences around that. And then my last question to you is, what's happening? What is happening in their life? Again, just say what you think, no right or wrong. Some of you might be feeling a little bit hesitant because you're thinking there must be a right or wrong, and that's your belief system. Lonely, demoralized, illness, loneliness, suffering, thinking of suicide. Yes, thank you. Illness, growing old, friends have died, feeling alone. Yeah, great. What have you based your answers on? What have you based your answers on? The words used. Yeah, definitely some of the words used. Things like, it's hard for me to get about, I'm a prisoner in my own home, lots of the old crowd have gone, personal experience, language used. Yeah. What else? Tone, length of sentences. Great. Yeah. So what we have here is I'm going to just close that Q&A down now, is that we have the tone. You can see me. I deliberately tried to be still whilst I was reading it, but you could see me. You had the tone. We had the words. We build a big picture of what we believe to be true that is happening. And I want you to do exactly the same again, but this time I just want you to read it. I'm just going to give you about 30 seconds to read the next slide. Again, I'm going to ask you the same questions. So, male or female, please. Again, answer in the Q&A, male or female. Let's see what we have this time. Okay, some of you are unsure. That's fine. Yep. So you're not judging and not making an opinion. And lots of you are saying female. I don't think I've seen a male or female yet. Okay. So yeah, but the majority of you had female there. Again, what sort of age is this person? What age is this person? Young 20s, younger, mid-20s, not clear. Okay, great, lovely. And the third question, of course, is what's happening? What is happening here? Getting a lift home, yeah. Feeling lost, yeah. An abduction, haha. Police interview, yeah. Not sure what's happening. Could be a funny story or something bad, yeah. Concern about motive, yeah. Man driving her somewhere, hopefully home. She's feeling disorientated, yeah. That word disorientated is really powerful, Lauren, as well, isn't it? When we read something like that, it forms a picture in our head, especially if you read crime thrillers or social media, or the news is really good at using those powerful language. Now, what was missing? What was missing in this section of the exercise? What was missing? Tone, the outcome. Yeah, so context and the outcome was definitely missing. But tone, and that is such an important thing. We know that tone and words and our non-verbal communication all play a massive part in how we communicate with each other. And if we're missing one of them, then it makes it harder. And what happens is that our assumptions start to play. They start to take over. So, of course, these are my slides, and I like to be right. But he got me home so fast, I would not have believed it possible. Your mind will make up a story based on your belief system. How many of you have read a book, then gone to see the film and gone, oh my goodness, the film was awful, nothing like the book at all? Because in your mind, you'd already made up all the characters in your head of how they sounded, what they looked like, who they were going to be. And so the film doesn't represent what's in your mind, because we're very good about making up things in our minds. So active listening is the power, is the superpower behind communication. When you can learn to actively listen, and you can learn to put all your biases to one side and all your assumptions, then what happens is we can find out what the motivator is for the other person. When we know what the motivator is, then we can have our predictive dialogue. Then we can have our conversations around, okay, this is what I believe to be true. I just want to check in that this is true. And then we can have those open conversations. So we've got just over 15 minutes for questions. Again, please put your questions in the Q&A. And Finn is very kindly going to read some of those questions out. Hopefully.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nicky. That was fantastic. Really thought-provoking. I'm definitely going to watch that back. And I've got a lot more questions myself as well. So we are going to jump into Q&A. We've got just over 15 minutes. So any questions you have got, please add them into the Q&A. We're going to get them to Nicky. I'm going to kind of kick off with one or two myself, actually. So you were talking about, I think, first of all, thinking about that kind of partner dynamic you were talking about earlier on in the presentation, and this kind of people in this emotional brain state. And I'm just wondering, because a lot of people are going to have really difficult challenges, granted, childcare, I think was the example you gave. And the context here is, of course, sustainable commuting. And just kind of playing that out, because, a lot of people will often give a softer version of the truth because they know they're less likely to be judged for, say, I can't cycle because I have childcare issues, to I can't cycle because I don't want to. And so, I'm trying to think about how we could apply some of these active listening principles to really get past any potential smokescreen and address potentially the real objection, and how we can then apply that active listening and reasoning to kind of address that, not necessarily to change people's minds, but to have the best possible chance of getting people to seriously consider it from their logical brain state rather than their emotional brain state.
Yeah, and that's a great question. So we know that to get somebody from an emotional state to a logical state, that active listening is key. And then when we look at how we use communication to show that we're listening with those big open questions, there is actually something called a questions funnel, which we don't have time to go into in much detail today. But if you imagine an upside down pyramid, and it starts with open questions, and gradually what we do is we funnel in and hone down until we get to those very probing questions. And find out exactly what it is that's going on. So when somebody gives you that initial oh no, I can't do it because of childcare. A big open question could be, what exactly, if we, and use the word exactly because it hones the brain down, is what exactly is it about the childcare that you're struggling with? Because childcare is huge, isn't it? It's absolutely huge. And it's like an overwhelm for somebody. And when we're feeling overwhelmed, we immediately go into our emotional brain. So it's about then helping the other person to work out what exactly is the issue? Because when we know exactly what the issue is, then we can deal with it. Then we can start to put steps into place, and we can get them to think about the steps they can put into place. But until we've addressed the overwhelm and narrowed it down, it will be more challenging. It will be more challenging. If I give you an example from my old world, imagine somebody's trapped in a bank because they're doing an armed robbery that's gone wrong. Suddenly they're surrounded by loads of armed police officers, and I phone in and I speak to them. One of the first things I can guarantee you that they will say is they'll say something along the lines of, I want a helicopter and £1 million. And what they're actually telling me is they don't want to be there. So the end result will not be a helicopter and £1 million. It'll probably be, I'll get you a solicitor and we can have a sandwich at the police station, because that's the logical thing. But at the moment, they're in that overwhelm. I don't want to be here. This is not what I planned. You're creating change in my life and all of those things. It's exactly the same when anybody does, when we're not in control, and if somebody implements a policy that doesn't seem to fit with our life, we feel that we're not in control. And when we're not in control, we're straight into emotional brain. So how do we give back a little bit of control to the other person so that they can feel that they are part of that process?
And we're not talking about listing the various different sustainable commuting modes they can have instead of driving alone, but it's really getting beyond that to understanding. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, if you sit with me and I'm in an emotional state and you tell me all of the different ways that I can get to work, I'm not listening to any of them. I don't care. I don't care about them. I care about me because I'm selfish. And so you have to tell me what's in it for me. Sell it to me of what's in it for me. Tell me the benefits. And the more that the benefit relates to me personally, the stronger it will be and the more likely I will be to listen.
Thank you, Nicky. We have got a couple more questions coming in. Don't forget, guys, there is the Q&A. Do add any questions you've got in. We've got about 10 minutes left. I've got one more for you myself, Nicky, and this is more, I'm not sure necessarily whether it directly applies to active listening, but it's more around thinking from our client's perspective and for a number of the people who are going to be attending this webinar today. It's going to be a large organization, over 1,000 employees, maybe as many as 5,000, perhaps if we're working at NHS Trust, for instance, excuse me, or in a higher education setting. And whilst I'm sure everyone would love to have the time and the resource to be able to have these one-to-one conversations with everybody in the business, the reality is a lot of the communication is done through written means, through email, digital comms, or maybe offline through posters and that kind of thing. And so again, when with the communication style talking about sustainable commuting, again, that message could theoretically trigger an emotional response. They want us to start commuting more sustainably. And so I'm wondering whether there are any active listening principles, such as the softer language, that can be applied to written communications that can get people in that logical brain space again, not necessarily to convince people or influence people there and then, but maybe that open the door for the types of conversations that we can have one-to-one.
Yeah, and again, and that's great because communication through the written word is much harder than it is when you're sat in front of somebody, giving them a good listening to and showing that you can be in touch with what's happening in their life. I am fortunate enough to work for a charity called Shout, which is a text message crisis helpline. And so everything that we do is via text message. So you can still label people's emotions. You can still use softer language like, I am wondering what, and I'm considering this. And how do you then translate that into a document of a poster? for me, it would be about thinking of all those challenges that have already come up. So all of those things that you can predict have come up, and then addressing that in the poster. So we already, if you sat down and did your 4Ps of what's the purpose of this publication? Why am I putting this poster out? Why am I putting this message out onto the internal forums? Because if you're not clear around what that purpose is initially, your messaging will be unclear. And then just go through the second one. What's the plan? What's the perspective? What are all the reasons that we know that people are pushing back on this? What are their belief systems? What are our belief systems as an organization? What are our belief systems as an organization from an external stakeholder point of view, and all of those other things? And then you'll start to see that there is a clarity around that resistance. And then we can start to use the things that we've talked about in predictive dialogue and the power of because and the active listening. Because it's if you stick a poster up that addresses my concern, then I'm like, oh, hang on a sec. I'm more likely to read it because it's about me. And people, we're all about what's in it for me. What's in it for me?
I think that's a really, really interesting point, which is worth taking away. Is that whilst we're focusing a lot on sustainable commuting, really a lot of the challenges I suppose the real reason that people might be looking at sustainable commuting initiatives to reduce their carbon footprint, the source of that is overwhelmingly it's people driving alone in a vehicle. And actually there are a lot of reasons that we might want to get people out of a vehicle, particularly alone. Could be related to parking, could be related to a number of different things. And so it's actually trying to translate all of these different reasons. It means to an end, right? Getting people out of a vehicle, translating all of these different benefits in case one of those might just trigger that thought process with the individual. And then again, it paves the way for that conversation. Is that kind of where you were going with that, Nicky?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. So you address it. Somebody reads the poster and they're like, oh, hang on a sec, that's what my fear is. Because it will be fear. So because we generally come at everything from fear or joy perspective. And if we fear something, we'll be more resistant to it. And fear of change is huge because it changes my lifestyle. It changes what I have to do. It changes, and because it's a forced change rather than I'm going into a new job and these are the rules of the new job. This is I've been working here for a while and now you're changing what I do. So it's more of a forced change where I don't have or I perceive I don't have as much control. Of course, I do have control. I can do whatever I want to do. But my emotional brain is like, whoa, this is like scary. This is new. I don't feel comfortable with this. I'm going to push back. I'm going to push back until somebody says to me, oh, I can see the world from your perspective. And actually, what I'm seeing is your whole day is going to be different. And not only is your whole day going to be different, but your other half is giving you a load of grief around, well, that changes my life as well. How's that going to work? And not only that, but you're quite comfortable in what you do. And so, and then you're like, oh yeah, actually, hang on a sec. That's me. I feel like you're talking to me.
So we've got a question, Nicky, from Chris Carslake. Do you think it is ever possible for a passionate person or a person who's passionate about climate change to not get emotionally driven? Is it sometimes to switch out the listener?
Chris, that is a great question. So first of all, there is nothing wrong with being passionate about something and knowing that you get emotionally driven by it. And there's nothing wrong about having opposing opinions. I'm going to give you an example that happened to me a couple of weeks ago. I was having a conversation with a relative in my life, and it was something that was against my values, against my core beliefs, against everything I believe to be true, to the point where they were using language that made me so angry. I could feel myself getting angry. And I had to literally say to myself, if you react, this relationship is going to be over. So you have a choice, Nick. You react based on how you're feeling right now, or you react later and have a conversation when you're in a much better emotional state where you can still put across your point of view, but without damaging the relationship. And that's what I chose to do. So we always have choice. We can definitely be passionate about what we think. We can definitely be emotionally driven at times when someone challenges that, but then we have the choice around how we're going to respond. Is it sometimes to switch out the listener? Not 100% sure what that means. But I know that my listening went from combative listening to be right, to active listening to what was I actually hearing, to then using reflective language in that moment to buy myself some time of, gosh, you sound really frustrated about the current climate in this country at the moment, to then being able to bring myself back down and actually receiving an apology from them half a day later, and then having a proper conversation. So hopefully that answers your question with that example.
Thank you, Nicky. We've got a great question here from Lauren Donnelly. And I have to say, I might fall into this camp as well, actually, Nicky, particularly with my hosting webinar hat on and with an eye on the time. But so I used to be good at active listening, but I found that during the last few years, I'm more distracted by my own brain during conversations. It sometimes feels like a default to stop actively listening, both face to face and on calls. So do you have any advice on how to find the likely cause of this and how to train my active listening skills?
Yeah, and this is where the practice comes in, Lauren, and I see your question after that as well about emotional state, is that you when you can being conscious and being aware of how you react, so you already know how you're reacting, and that sometimes you move away from actively listening, and that's perfectly normal and perfectly natural and completely understandable in many circumstances. When I personally find myself doing that, I will treat it as a practice. I will go, oh, hang on a sec, they're still talking and I'm definitely not listening. I'm planning tomorrow's dinner, and then I'm like, why am I not listening to them? Maybe they're talking about something I'm not really very interested in, or maybe something more important is over here in the sidelines. So I want to focus on that. So I will go back to that. I'm going to summarize what they've said at the end of this conversation. Right, I better start listening because otherwise I'm going to look stupid. And then the fear of the looking stupid of doing the summary is far more powerful than the fear of not actually listening. And so I treat it as a practice session, and I go back in the moment. Look, honestly, I'd love to sit here and tell you I do this all the time, 24/7, but that would be a lie. I'm an emotional human being, and sometimes I find people, I get distracted, I get bored by the conversation, or somebody emotionally triggers me. So what I've learned is that becoming more conscious, the only person I can change is me. Can't change the other person, so the only person I can change is me. So do I have the time to be in the moment with them? Great, lovely. Do I want a proper conversation? Yes, I do. I'm going to practice my listening skills and bring myself back into it. But congratulations for being so conscious. And by the way, 90 seconds, if you can not respond for 90 seconds when you know you're emotional, that will help. That will help relax the emotional brain into the logical brain and get you back to that logical state. I could talk about emotional brain and logical brain for hours. We're rapidly running out of time, but hopefully that gives you some tips and tricks on how you can do that.
Thank you very much, Nicky. Well, you are right there. We have run out of time, and so this is the final in the three-part behavior change session with Nicky. But it's been a great series. We have once again the other two sessions on the Mobility Ways YouTube channel. This will be uploaded soon, and everyone here today will get a copy of this recording sent to you by email. But no doubt we'll have Nicky back if you'll have us in the future, because there's a lot more stuff to develop there, I think. Thank you for attending today. Thank you for all of your questions and your participation. Keep an eye out for other events on your email. We'll be sending across some of those to you in the next week or so. And thank you to you, Nicky. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. Goodbye.